Good morning, everybody. How are you guys? Um, just reminded today, the significance of each day that we have, of each present moment. I know that Zach and Heather are moving at the end of the month. I know. And we just realized, what a gift it is to be the church together, to travel together. That there's chapters of life, and we want to just make sure that we're savoring every single Sunday that we have together. What a gift it is, right? And yesterday was just delightful being able to serve together, just a reminder of how important that is for us in our rhythm of life, that life is not just to receive, but to be pouring out on others. It was just a beautiful day filled with so much joy. I was thinking, I had a conversation with somebody this morning from our church and just saying, how are you? And, you realize all of us have a quick response to that, right? And then a whole nother level of response, really, right? When you're like, how are you? I'm fine. Well, how are you really? In spiritual direction, we call this depthing, right? What's the question behind the question? And if all of us are answering that, there's probably a question here right at the surface, but as we kind of peel back those layers, what we find is that all of us today are carrying longings, fears, things that are unknown, worries about tomorrow, pleasures, joys, all of this together as one. I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about this idea that I think it was started actually by the guy who created Toyota, has this principle called the 5 whys. Has anybody heard of this? Like if you want to understand something, you ask why 5 times. This lets you get to the actual issue, that there's something there that's immediate. You ask that question, why is this broke? Well, because, right? But if you really want to understand, it takes about 5 whys to get underneath this all. In other words, it takes curiosity and it takes a little bit of persistence to get down that deep. This example that was used, which I don't know if this is necessarily true, so I'm just going to roll with it anyways, by way of illustration. If I'm technically wrong, you can let me know afterwards. But they were saying rocket boosters, why are they the diameter they are? Does anybody know? Tunnels. You have to get that rocket booster from where it's created here all the way down to Florida, and they got to do it by train, and so that rocket booster has to fit through the tunnel. Why? Well, they're the width they are because kind of the track, and there's kind of an estimation there of appropriate width that's based off of what? Well, roads, automobiles. Okay, so automobiles are about this wide because they've got to fit on a road. And why are roads that width? Well, it goes all the way back to Roman roads have been that width. And so in the end, how did the Romans decide that that was the width of a road? We're why? Well, that was a chariot, and chariots were pulled by 2 horses. So that rocket booster is the width of 2 horses. Good to know, right? Why, right? You're getting down underneath all of this, which you're thinking, no, there's got to be some more scientific reason for that, right? And you're actually, it's just 2 horses. We're launching rockets into space based on the width of 2 horses. And this way of thinking, it kind of fits if you're a Ted Lasso fan. You think of the best Ted Lasso moment is there with the darts, right? And he's going, there's this quote. I think that I don't even think it's technically Walt Whitman, but he credits Walt Whitman as saying, be curious, not judgmental, right? And it's just a great line in that. If you're curious, you're going to ask why. Have you played a lot of darts, Ted, right? Such a great scene in that movie. But interesting how he contrasts that between judgment, quick to decide, quick to determine, not to get underneath and to understand. And that this sort of tendency on our part to not ask why, to quickly judge, gets in the way of a lot of things. It gets in the way of us really seeing each other. How are you doing, Jeff? I'm exhausted. Why? Well, I think I'm working too hard. Well, I feel like maybe I'm kind of behind. I just always feel like I'm behind. Well, because when I look around at others and I see other people and I'm thinking, I think they're doing more, so I'm comparing myself. Well, I guess deep down I just want to feel like I'm doing enough. Well, because I want to know that I'm valued, right? I want to know that my life has worth. I want to know that I matter, right? We start with a problem, exhaustion. Maybe you just need to get more sleep, right? Which is true, but you go, interesting when you kind of depth these things and you peel back the layers, most of the time where you end up is in this heart space. The deeper things of the heart, the things that matter really deep down, the things that maybe wake you up in the middle of the night, right? What are the longings that are there? The concerns, the fears. These things lurk under the surface, and sometimes we're not even aware of what those things might be. And I say all of this by way of a segue into our passage because we come to this really interesting moment in the book of Acts. Paul and Barnabas are now traveling into Greece and Rome, actually, technically, into this town of Lystra. And as they are in this city, they do kind of what they've been doing. There's a miracle that takes place, and we've seen this happen. It actually feels very similar to other miracles that have happened. But we see the crowd respond in a very different way. As a result of it, in fact, Paul is kind of thrown off by it. They haven't encountered this, and he has to pivot on the spot. But what he does, to me, reflects an insightfulness, a curiosity on Paul's part that's going to get deep down underneath the surface and address kind of the deeper questions. To me, it models something that I think we can look at like the specifics, and they're definitely pertinent to us. But when we look at his whole presence and how he responds, I think it gives us an indication of how we too can be responding to others. So this is Acts chapter 14. I'm going to read 8 through 18 as kind of the heart of our passage here. And it says this: In Lystra there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called up, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus. Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We're bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He's shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. What an interesting moment. And this is a very unique kind of thing that we're going to see is going to happen now more than once in the book of Acts, where Paul and Barnabas are talking to a group of people that are totally unchurched. Have you ever had conversations with somebody like that? Where they just don't have a clue what you're talking about. You're like, oh, well, it says here in the Bible this, and they're like, what? What are you talking about? Maybe some of you are sitting out there and you're like, I don't really understand all of this stuff. Paul and Barnabas, as they've been going into cities, remember, they go straight to the synagogue. And the synagogue is this place, even in Rome, where Gentiles and Jews would gather together to read the Torah. Now, the Jews would read the Torah like they were kind of following along with their own lectionary reading, but there was Gentiles that had said, there's something to this. They called them God-fearers, and these Gentiles would come in, and they too would participate in the synagogues to listen to the scriptures, so that there was this common ground that were there. They had all come to hear these words being read and to seek to understand God through these words. Here we're out in the street. This is not happening in the synagogue, and this is just sort of the natural response of these people raised in this culture of mythology. They see power and they respond by going, oh, the gods are walking amongst us. Now, as we talk about questions, there's a few questions that might come to mind. I wonder if, like as it's specified here, I wonder if in Paul's mind he was a little bit worried about, like, why does Barnabas get to be Zeus and I'm Hermes? Right? You see that? They call me Hermes, but that's because I was doing the talking. And you're like, really, Paul? Or maybe Barnabas was just a little more impressive than you, like Zeus and Hermes. Like, Paul's like, hey, like, I don't want to be Hermes. Whatever the case is, they kind of name these two. This is who this is, the father of the gods and the son of the God who's the mouthpiece. And Paul's like, dang it. They're trying to get caught up, and it's an interesting sort of moment that happens because the response is in Lycaonian, and this probably was unfamiliar to Paul and Barnabas, that they're there preaching, and people would have known Greek, they would have been speaking in Greek, but the people begin responding in their own language, and they're going, what's going on here, right? All of a sudden, they start gathering like, wait, something's happening. They're like bringing bowls out, and they're like bringing wreaths out, and they're like, what are you guys doing? Tomorrow's Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. And so I was thinking, by way of a Star Wars reference, it kind of reminds me of like C-3PO and the Ewoks. You remember this, right? Like all of a sudden, these little Ewoks are like, they see this gold robot, and they're like, he's a god, right? And they're like, wait, what? Him? But this is kind of what's happening. And they're all of a sudden realizing, oh no. They saw this power and they've attributed it to Paul and Barnabas. And they've now put Paul and Barnabas within their understanding, their context, that there are these gods out there. And these gods do things. They are in the weather. They give you crops. They provide provision along the way. Some of these good things are the result, maybe, that the gods are happy. But sometimes bad things happen as well. There's droughts, there's famines, there's these kind of things that occur. And so that must be that the gods are angry. And so what you do to kind of navigate through this space is you sacrifice to them. You give of something valuable, hoping that in some way you can appease the gods. This whole system of sacrifice, Paul and Barnabas all of a sudden are like, oh no, like total backfire. That this miracle has been attributed to them, and the people are thinking, how do we make sure these people know that like we're on their side? Well, what's wrong with this? Well, a whole misunderstanding of how divine power works. That the gods truly are not angry, that something has taken place called the gospel. That there's good news, and it fundamentally changes this whole way of seeing the world, if we're understanding it right. What are these people doing? Well, they're offering sacrifices. Why? Because they believe that in the end, this power is supernatural, and they want it to be on their side. Why? Well, because deep down, they want blessing, they want protection, they want favor. Why? They want their life to flourish. That they have this like deep down desire and longing for certain things. And I think sometimes if we kind of approach this situation, we like look at these people and be like, psh, Greek mythology, wrong, right? When in fact you go, these are human beings seeking to navigate the complexities of life with all the same fears and worries and longings. They've come up with a system, and it's a system that sort of makes sense, right? We would call this pagan, but pagan isn't to be like that it's idiotic or something like that. It's trying to comprehend and understand the world. And Paul, instead of quoting scriptures to them, is going to address those longings. He's going to address the world around them, and he's going to go, as it turns out, life is not this sort of fearful appeasement of the gods. That this thing that you are grappling for and reaching for is actually reaching towards you, pursuing you. That the blessings of God are all around you if you have the eyes to see. And this shift in thinking, I go, it's worth us thinking about, because I think we still live in this world where there are just so many different ways of looking at life and looking through the lens. If it's political, if it's social, if it's economic, all of these things, all of us have like a story and a way of looking at the world. And we live in this world that is incredibly fractured over whose narrative is right. Peter is going to say, when you share with gentleness and respect. And I think part of that respect is curiosity. It's taking the time to ask why. Why do you believe that? Whatever that is, that opinion, that statement that you make, what is underneath that? And too often, or I think, if we are willing to ask that question, what we often find is that each of those things that we hold to where there's disagreement, if we get a few layers under, we're like, oh gosh, me too. I understand that. I understand that concern or that longing or that fear. It's a way of seeing the humanity of somebody else. And instead of responding with condemnation, like Paul, you respond with invitation. Look around you. There's blessing all over that you're not sacrificing towards, or you're not earning, or you're not deserving, that this rain just falls on the world. Look at the creation. Look at the miraculous nature and design of all of these things. Look at the sea and the mystery of it all. He points to the vastness of that and then leads them back to this place of joy. Joy that breaks in, the goodness that is in life all around them. Paul doesn't paint the picture like he's been doing, which, remember, if we've listened carefully to Paul and honestly Peter and honestly Jesus even before that, is when they tell the story, they go back to Abraham and talk about Moses and talk about David and talk about this story God has been telling through the Jews. But here we see Paul, without that sort of overlap, goes all the way back into the creation itself. Points to the world around them and says, look, notice the power of God. Historically, they call the creation God's first book, filled with God's insights and wisdom and design. Paul's going to say, like, you look at the world around you and you can see the attributes of God made manifest. He says that in Romans. And here, this is his approach. What a fantastic approach. And I thought it'd be interesting to call you up one by one and go, how would you respond? In a situation looking for common ground, how would you tell the story? It's worth us thinking about. Do we even know? Like, what do we root that in? You see Paul tying this all the way back to the beginning, pointing to all the beautiful things in life, drawing their attention to this and saying, this is God who's behind all of these things. I think it's the chief mistake that a kind of materialist world view teaches, is that life and creation, it was like accidental. If that's the case, then like so are you, right? If all of this stuff is just sort of a fluke of nature or the rolling of the dice, then it's meaningless all the way down. I think that's kind of what Einstein was getting at when he's like, God doesn't play dice with the universe, right? That he's going, there's something more to all of this in the specificity of it and the intricacy of it and the beauty in all of it. They point to the beauty as a way of leading back to the truth. The rain that you didn't earn, the food you didn't create on your own, the joy that shows up uninvited. We know this from C.S. Lewis's testimony, is that he always was like troubled by joy. He had this tight little worldview that to him made sense, except that joy would break in and he didn't know what to do with it, right? What is this joy? What is this beauty? Paul's like, that is the favor of God. These flashes of goodness are not random. They're signs. They're pointing us to something deeper. God isn't this God that you're like going to go out there and find out there. There's a story of the first Russian astronaut when he returned to Earth. His response was like, yeah, I was out there and guess what? There's no God out there, right? And you're like, okay, that's not what, right? Like, that's, it's not like he's lurking out there in space, right? You're like, no, like this God that's behind all of this. You're not going to see him that way. But what you are going to see is his effects, his fingerprints all over this if you're paying attention. All over this if you're curious and questioning. Paul says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. It's all there if we're willing to look, and then with curiosity to follow it back to its source. This quote from C.S. Lewis, he talks about seeing these things properly requires us to see them with gratitude. And he says, gratitude exclaims very properly, how good of God to give me this. Adoration says, what must the quality of that being, whose far off and more momentary coruscations are like this? Coruscations is a great word, but they're like these beams of light, and he says one's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. When we look at our life, when we look at this day, when we look at the joys of these things, are we following them back to the source? The gift of relationships, the gift of doing life with each other. What a beautiful picture that is of what God has blessed us with. The sweet little children, like you hear the little cries in here and you're like, just the tenderness of those moments. I mean, as a parent with older kids, I'm like, savor that, right? Those moments are so short and sweet. They don't feel like that at the time, but tender little gifts all the time. Good coffee, like praise be to God. What an unexpected joy. But these things, like Paul's going, okay, no, look around you. God has filled this. This flash of healing is brilliant, right? And we're like, wow. And I think God does that at times because that's what it takes. But really what God wants us to do is to notice the small little miracles happening all around us. Something as miraculous as that next breath that you take. This world that God has created that we might thrive within and then live lives of abundance, giving back, pouring ourselves out, living lives of virtue that have eternal meaning and significance. This is what they're calling them to. Paul speaks to them about these surrounding miracles and then draws them to this deeper reality that God is not angry, But God is loving them already. In that place of fear that naturally thinks, have I done enough to deserve this? He's going, look at the way that God is already providing for you. Remember this every time it rains. Remember this. Remember the heart of God is for you. You hear Jesus saying, in this world you're going to have trouble, but take heart. I've overcome the world. We talk about those deep longings of the heart, and it really is an opportunity for us when we think about this to understand ourselves. What is it that I'm longing for? I was reading this woman, Martha Beck, and she says that when she's dealt with longings in other people, she says there's really just four longings that she hears. Longing for peace, for freedom, for joy, and for love. Every single person around you is longing for those things, hungering for those things. Even if they tell you they're not, even if they tell you they're resigned that that's not a reality. This was kind of Tolkien's thing in his story on fairy tales, is he was like, all these people that are like, I don't believe in any of this. And you're like, then why are they remaking Harry Potter? Because we love these fairy stories, right? Because they all point us to these deep longings of the heart. The people that are like, no, I don't believe this. You're like, yes, you do. In the middle of the night, you do. Peace, freedom, joy, love. And these people are sacrificing, trying to control these things, offering these sacrifices to the gods. And I think we have our own gods that we sacrifice to. I wonder if in some ways you're like the God of health, right? When you look at the billions of dollars that we spend on looking younger, trying to run from these realities of life. How do we appease the gods? Well, we do it with all these metrics, like we measure our sleep and we measure our calorie intake and we work out, and all of these things are beautiful disciplines, but guess what? They're not going to allow you to live forever. And this reminder that this world we live in is a temporary space. We just had sweet Evelyn's memorial this last week. It was so lovely. But such a reminder that life is short. We have this beautiful moment, this beautiful chapter here on earth, but it's hard and it's difficult. What do we do with that? We don't try to grasp onto it, but instead to live with this open-handedness. Well, how do you do that? Well, you understand that there is a God who has come down. I love how they look at Paul and Barnabas and they're like, the gods have come to earth. And they're like, wrong, but sort of right. It's not Paul and Barnabas, but this narrative in their mind, a God coming down and becoming human. Paul's like, that actually is the right answer to this. It's what we're here to talk about. That you're making these sacrifices to this God out there, but the truth is this is a God who has come down. The greatest miracle, the grand miracle of all, is the fact that this God did become human. He did walk here amongst you. But then what he did, rather than demanding sacrifices, is he sacrificed himself. Rather than demanding us to respond to him with some sort of act of worship, he instead made himself low, emptied himself, poured his life out for us, and models for us this greater reality that this ultimately in the end is the answer to these longings. That freedom is like laying aside these worthless idols that we pursue, the things like success and control, approval, security. These are the things we clutch at. And maybe fool ourselves at times into thinking that we have some level of control over. But the truth is we don't. The posture that we're being invited into is to follow in this God become human, his way, which is to take up our cross, to follow in his steps, as Peter says. The gospel is this ultimate miracle that points us to this greater reality that we are being invited into. And this is what Paul is inviting them into. That this small story, instead of just tearing it apart, he's going, this is all too small. That God is better than this. The news is better than this. This gospel is bigger than all of that. It's bigger than rain. It's bigger than food. It's even bigger than little moments of joy. All of these things are pointing us to a world where we properly belong. That we were made for something bigger than this. And God is pouring this out in hopes to awaken us to this reality. And I think this is important because I think this affects the whole posture when we have received this. All of a sudden, we're given this same permission to extend this invitation to those around, as Peter says, with gentleness and with respect. To find where people are searching and longing and connect there. To not get stuck battling over the surface level things, but to get down with those whys underneath the surface. To see that common ground of humanity and other people, and then to respond to that with this picture of hope. I read this in a book that I've been reading. Tolstoy's got this little chronicle of daily wisdom, and he quotes this philosopher Epictetus, a Stoic, saying, "Try to understand and remember that a person always tries to do what is best for himself. And if he is right when he does the best thing for himself, it's good. But if he is mistaken, it is bad, because suffering will follow after such mistakes. If you remember this, then you will never be upset by anybody. You will never reproach anybody, and you will never be an enemy to anybody." He's saying, give people the benefit of the doubt. Be curious, not judgmental. That people are trying to navigate through this world the best that they can. And what Paul so brilliantly does is, instead of battling them over truth, he presents them with beauty. Beauty that points them to what is good. Goodness that points them to what is true. And I think this is the approach. So often with evangelism, and we jump right into truth. When truth matters, it ultimately matters, but the dissonance is so often one of the heart. I think this is why Dostoevsky said, beauty will save the world. And I love this in Paul's message. He pulls them back to the beauty all around them and reminds them that this is the way to God. What a good invitation, I feel like, for us to think about the way that we are approaching others who maybe see things differently than us. To speak to the heart, to speak to those deeper questions. What if we are willing to ask those questions of ourselves as well? What am I pursuing? What am I worshiping? Paul points out to these idols, and he's going like, look, these things can't do anything for you, right? And yet we have our idols, the things that we clutch to. This passage to me is such a reminder to hold this with open hands. Instead, to open our eyes to what God is doing all around us. To pay attention to the moments of joy and beauty. To realize that God is shining these beams that he desires us to follow back to their source. These are invitations that are leading us home. And that God has been reaching out and continues to reach out for each day and each moment for our hearts. The story, interestingly enough, is going to take an abrupt turn. I wish this was like this great moment, but as it turns out, there's going to be a shift from the crowd. They end up taking up rocks and stoning Paul to the point where they think he's dead. But Paul, when he's standing back before the church leaders in Lystra, he says something really interesting. He says, we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And I thought, gosh, that to me is a heavy statement. That Paul points him to beauty, but he also understands that so much of this is going to involve suffering, difficulties. Life isn't just coruscations of light, it's hardships that we face. That in these things as well, the kingdom of God comes. And I think of this because I think this is profoundly what Jesus models for us. Is that ultimately this life is a challenge and it's difficult, that we face things that are going to cause us to waver and struggle. We need each other in that. But we come to the Lord's table because we remember that at the heart of all of this, that the grand miracle that ties us all together is this outpouring of love that invites us to do the same. This is God's heart on display. And that this picture of sacrifice is not something that we do to appease. It's something that we first receive. Jesus' sacrifice poured out on us. But as we receive, we then give. We participate. That this stream of God's love becomes our purpose, our mission in this lifetime. How do we respond to a world that is suffering and need? We do by opening up our hands and responding in love. Here's some questions I have for reflection as we draw this to a close and as we go to the Lord's table. What is something that you are currently pursuing that you believe will give you life? And what deeper longing seeks underneath it? Do you notice those things where your heart attaches to something where you're going, this is going to be the thing. This is going to be my answer. What are those things that we clutch to in this life? Number 2, where have you experienced joy, beauty, or goodness recently? How might those moments be pointing beyond themselves to something bigger? And number 3, who in your life might be reaching in a way that frustrates you? What changes when you become curious about their deeper longing? What an opportunity for us to come alongside people and point them to the hope, a hope that anchors us in eternity and is drawing us home.